The conventional understanding of European politics used to be that in order to get anything done, you need Germans on board. But now, with a deeply unpopular chancellor, a collapsing government, and a sluggish decision-making, many in Europe just simply don't care about Berlin's position at all. So, how important is Germany in the EU right now? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. This week, we're focusing on German politics, a topic that until a few years ago used to be considered predictable and, simply put, boring. But now, the German political scene has become one of the most unstable in Europe. On the one hand, we have a collapsing governing coalition. On the other hand, the rising threat of radical groups. The latter is especially unnerving for many observers in other countries. Consumed by problems with migration, security, economic downturn, the authorities in Berlin don't have the capacity to address the rise of radicals on both the left and the right side of the spectrum. What fuels their growing popular support? We try to find out in our first report.
The list of domestic problems faced by Chancellor Olaf Scholz's government seems endless. For one, there's the economy, tormented by long periods of stagnation and minimal growth. Germany used to be a European leader in terms of industrial output and economic development, but has since fallen far in the ranks. Many of the former industrial powerhouse's shining stars, including the Volkswagen Group, have announced significant layoffs. The country is also lagging behind in digital services and transformation. Its extensive red tape creates a very unfavorable ecosystem for innovation and startup culture. As a result, the German economy continues to rely on old-fashioned industries with very little investment in modern technologies. For many voters, poor economic performance is linked to failed migration policy. Olaf Scholz's government seems incapable of addressing growing migration pressure. According to data from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Germany has accepted the highest number of asylum seekers in Europe. Over the last decade, 1.4 million asylum applications have been accepted there, more than half of the EU total. As of August, over 150,000 applicants have filed for protection in Germany in 2024. The total number for this year is projected to be twice as high. Authorities are struggling to process the paperwork and control what goes on in temporary migrant shelters. Intelligence agencies warn that young men are particularly prone to radicalization there as they await their asylum decisions. If materialized, this threat could have disastrous consequences for domestic and European security. We know the European Union needs migrations. Germany needs immigration to meet its huge labor needs, which will become very high in the years to come.
Is immigration really the root cause of Germany's current problems? Should its radical parties be treated as serious threats to democracy? And is it time for the rest of Europe to start to do big things without German leadership? These are fundamentally questions not just about Germany, but about the future of the entire continent. And answering them tonight with me will be Florian Eder, editor at Süddeutsche Zeitung Dossier, Sophie Portenschlegel, deputy director at Jacques Delors Europe, and Yanis Emanuelidis, director of studies at the European Policy Centre. Good evening and welcome to Wider View. And so I'm going to begin with you, Florian, straight away on the most recent piece of political development in German politics, the firing of Christian Lindner, the finance minister, which effectively prompted a collapse of the German coalition government. Why did Olaf Scholz decide to pull the trigger on Lindner right now? And was it really something about the economy, or was there a dispute of different nature hanging in the background?
Look, thank you. Thanks for having me. We witnessed a long debate today in the German Bundestag, so in Parliament, where the Chancellor repeated his storyline that he lined out last week about the firing of Christian Lindner, his finance minister. We witnessed a very defiant Chancellor today, who didn't seem to be under the impression that he is going to be out of a job soon, most probably. But pretended that he had done everything right, and everybody else had not. So it is indeed, in the end, a question of ideological differences that we had all the time, of course, over the past 3 years of this coalition. But with the economic situation deteriorating, and we had a piece of news today by the most important advisory body of the German government on economic affairs, who basically smashed the forecast that the government itself put out only a very few weeks ago, and said the economy is going to shrink this year and grow by 0.4% only over the next year. So in this deteriorating situation, we had three parties, or we had two different camps, it's probably better to say, which had very different recipes to address the situation. And the FDP felt, so the liberals of Finance Minister Christian Lindner, felt more and more lonely, to say the least. And the other two felt more and more that there is no chance of doing anything meaningful, doing anything at all, with the liberals in the coalition. So it was probably time to pull the trigger. And it was revealing, and that's my last sentence for now, revealing that there was a sense of relief the day after, and not a sense of grief, or not a sense of, oh my God, what are we doing now? You could literally sense a sense of relief in every of the parties involved, and if I may say, in the rest of the country as well.
So maybe that's the high time to say that these were unlikely bedfellows from the very beginning. We're going to talk about the solitude of Christian Lindner right now with you, Sophie, because we know that Lindner was actually among the most alarming voices about the state of the German economy right now. But what I'm particularly interested to find out is, how bad is it really, and is it something that could be felt by the average German? We just witnessed the victory of Donald Trump very much on the discourse of economy, trying to persuade his own voters, your material conditions, your life situation has really gone worse under my predecessor, I'm going to make it better. Is it really something that Germans feel right now, or is it a preemptive worry that things will get worse in the future?
Maybe just to say a word on the US, I don't think that, voters voted for Donald Trump on economic reasons only. There's always cultural reasons behind that as well. And of course, a far-right populist rhetoric. On the German economy, I think we are in a situation where we know that the business, or the economic model that we had in the past decades doesn't work anymore. We had a huge spike in energy prices, of course, because Russian gas is not there anymore. So they tried to scramble to find other sources of energy, mostly also US LNG, also from Qatar, diversifying the sources. But that had a huge impact, of course, on energy prices, and therefore also on, the German economic powerhouse, I would say. We also have a demography issue where the German population is way too old, which means that it will be a huge issue for our economy going forward. We had inflation, we had an economic crisis, with COVID-19. So we have a war also to fund in Ukraine. So, of course, the fiscal space is getting more reduced, which means that going forward, we don't have a good economic outlook. When it comes to the responses that the liberals gave, it was a typical program of neoliberalism with spending cuts, social cuts, and no investments, knowing that Germany also has a debt brake in the constitution, which makes it very hard to say that you're going to spend more money. And I think that was also one of the main reasons this traffic light coalition did not work in the end, because, they had ideological differences on the solutions to make sure that we save the economy, knowing, of course, that Germany is an economic powerhouse in Europe. And I would say it's not enough to save the German economy. It's really a question of having a European approach to make sure that the economic model goes forward.
So on that note, over to you, Yanis, and a leap into the future. Because Olaf Scholz is, for all intents and purposes, a lame duck chancellor right now. What will his last 3 months in office until the elections in February look like? And does he actually understand that he's probably going to be out of job, just like Florian addressed that at the very start, in a couple of months? Or is there a shred of hope among himself or his closest allies that he will somehow remain in office beyond February?
Well, I think what we will see over the next months is that the country will be in full election mode, and that obviously is going to affect how Chancellor Scholz will be operating, how the coalition, the remaining parts of the coalition will be operating. There are some elements of legislations which they still aspire to get through. There are also some budgetary decisions what they aspire to get through, and they need to support from other parts of the Bundestag, from the opposition. That's a big question mark as to whether they will get the support. So there are things that still need to be done, but we will be full in election mode. And you were asking as to whether Scholz knows what his future brings for him. I think that he personally believes that he can do better than the polls now suggest. I think that he has the impression that he will do well when he will be opposing Friedrich Merz, the chancellor candidate of the CDU-CSU. He thinks that this, and the SPD thinks that this is a potential for them to do better than the polls now indicate.
But I'm going to jump on this a little bit, Yanis, and ask you perhaps a provocative question. Does it have to be Scholz himself? Because it's a different story when we talk about the polls for SPD, and I think it's a different story about the perception of Scholz. It was a traffic light coalition. Maybe someone else from within that set of parties could replace him without necessarily handing over the power to CDU-CSU or someone else.
Well, I think if you look into the numbers for the CDU-CSU are now beyond 30% of the electorate, so they have a relative majority. The chances are high that the CDU will also be putting forward the next chancellor. So Friedrich Merz's chances of becoming the next chancellor are very high. But what you're alluding towards is whether there could be an alternative candidate to Scholz. And there are discussions. There are also some in the SPD who think that someone else, the defense minister Pistorius, would be a better suited candidate, that he could or should replace Scholz. But I'm sure that Scholz does not want this, and that there is no way of getting around him. The question then is what happens after the elections have taken place, what kind of coalition can be formed, and what that then means for the future of Scholz himself.
About a lot of hypotheticals here, and I'm going to break that discussion for now. Thank you very much for these exhaustive comments about the domestic situation in Germany, but equally important for everyone on the continent is how Germany performs on the international stage. So let's switch perspectives now and see the results of German foreign policy. After Angela Merkel went into political retirement, many in Europe began to wonder, will the continental center of gravity remain in Germany? A few years later, nobody is asking that question anymore, because the answer is obvious. How did Berlin lose its influence in international affairs? We explore this dynamic in our next report.
Once Russian troops began the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, questions loomed over a possible Western response. The Biden administration feared that a dependency on Russian fossil fuels could hinder the EU's readiness to help Kiev. Inside the bloc, divisions also arose. The French and the British were ready to assume leadership, but others were more cautious. In fact, France's president, Emmanuel Macron, believed Germany to be the weakest link in the European wartime coalition. Berlin initially tried to prove him wrong. Olaf Scholz announced the famous Zeitenwende, a historic change in Germany's foreign policy direction. It was meant to be a decisive strategy that would break with a long-standing tradition of restraint and non-engagement. But very few actions followed these declarations. Germany ranks only 16th in military aid to Ukraine as percentage of GDP. Negotiations over the handover of Leopard 2 tanks and Taurus missiles dragged on for months. Ukraine became so impatient with Scholz that some Ukrainian officials began to say Zeitenwende was just a smokescreen. Other avenues of foreign policy didn't yield much success either. Partners in Europe have accused Scholz of being too close to China and lacking a vision for the entire continent. Even within the reactivated Weimar Triangle, it is Poland and France who seem to be showing more initiative. With a second Donald Trump administration approaching, the playing field is getting even more complicated. The question now is, will Olaf Scholz find a way for Germany to become great again?
So, Florian, I want to begin with you again and ask about an overall assessment. It's been over 3 years since Zeitenwende was announced by Olaf Scholz, with a lot of pomp and a lot of splendor, a historical sea change in the foreign policy paradigms of Germany. Did it meet its initial objectives? Because when you speak, for instance, as we've just mentioned, with Ukrainian officials, mostly off the record though, they would tell you very often it was just a smokescreen. It was a declaration aimed at the domestic audience that didn't really yield tangible results. Where are we now on that front?
Well, look, it's a mixed picture as always. Of course, the spending was increased. There is a $100 billion extra fund for the military, for the Bundeswehr, and there are, I would agree with that, declarations to support Ukraine and others in a more decisive way. Of course, as we can see, looking at the situation in Ukraine, it didn't meet its objectives, as in let Ukraine win the war. But it's not that nothing had happened. We heard last week when Chancellor Scholz announced the sacking of his finance minister, a very decisive chancellor who said that he was standing up for Ukraine, and Lindner was the one kind of to be careful and to not want finance support for Ukraine any longer. In the days after, I dared to be skeptical from the beginning, but in the days after and today again, it turned out that it's a kind of, he pretended that it's about Ukraine. Indeed, it was about the fact that Chancellor Scholz didn't want to make a decision between the welfare state and the military. And so he blamed his former coalition partner, for forcing him to make the choice. That he, as a chancellor, didn't want to do. So, long story, of course, something had happened. Of course, it was a disappointment for many neighbors, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. And if I talk to European officials and diplomats, what Scholz said was prudence. Many others, actually most others, perceived as hesitation and as doubt, perhaps. So that's his problem, and it's not just the problem of communication, as people would often put it. It is a question of substance.
So, Sophie, on that note, let's bring that discussion closer to where you are in your area of interest in Europe. There used to be a consensus in European politics that German leadership was maybe not always necessary, but very beneficial for all major projects that anybody wanted to put through the European Union institutions. Is it still the case? Do other actors within the European Union still ask for the German point of view before undertaking major actions?
I'm sure they do, and the problem is that Germany remains one of the biggest countries in terms of population and still in the economy, so you're not going to change that anytime soon. The problem that we saw, especially with the last coalition, is that it was extremely dysfunctional. So the government was mostly busy with itself, very inward-looking. It didn't have much time to do much on EU policy. It could have done so, but then the problem was also that Scholz and Macron didn't get on well personally, so they didn't try very much to find new initiatives after Next Generation EU, which was like the COVID fund in 2021. So since then, there hasn't been much happening. At the same time, France also had elections this year, legislative elections. So we are in a situation where we see EU member states very much inward looking, and therefore having less time and putting less effort in coordinating their policies at EU level, and that obviously has an impact on foreign policy, especially
quick follow-up questions here. A quick follow-up question here, Sophie, because you rightly pointed out that France has had elections, and for all intents and purposes, the government in France wasn't particularly functional either for a long period of time. Some people would say that it remains partially functional. In the absence of clear, efficient leadership from Germany and a similar problem in France, do you think that the overall balance of power in the European Union has shifted, or is it too early to tell?
Oh, I think it already has shifted. It definitely has shifted to Poland since Mr. Tusk is there as well. Since, Poland has been so engaged also in Ukraine. You could see now that with Keir Starmer as new British Prime Minister, there's also a much bigger effort also from that side to cooperate together in defense and security. And I think that's maybe a good thing. I just hope that Germany and France aren't going to be in the way. The problem is that it's you still cannot overlook those two countries, so they still will have to also make some efforts to make sure that they are there at European level and also at international level, especially since we will have a Trump in the White House in January, which means that especially on security and defense, Europe does not have any time to lose, because we might potentially use the US security umbrella. We don't know what Trump has planned, so it's very much in the interest of all of us to work together now.
Mm-hmm. Yanis, a question to you right now. Trump in the White House in January, which translates into a 6 weeks, give or take 6 weeks of an overlap between Olaf Scholz and Donald Trump before the elections happen in Germany. How will Scholz and whoever comes after him position himself or herself towards the second Trump administration?
Well, first of all, Trump 2 will be very different from the first Trump we witnessed. It will be much more difficult to cooperate with him. He will be also ready to take revenge. It's payback time, as you have heard him say. So he will be a massive challenge from a European perspective. And the question is, how will not only the Germans, but how will Europe in general react to him? Will they be able to be united, or will they be divided when reacting to a Donald Trump who will put a lot of pressure on us, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the situation in the Middle East, when it comes to the economy, with his idea of putting on tariffs. So we will be facing a lot of pressures from Donald Trump from January onwards, and actually it has already started.
But
and
sorry
the question
to interrupt you here a little bit, Yanis. Some people in the European political space, and I'm not just referring to the likes of Viktor Orban for obvious reasons, but some politicians tend to say maybe it's not actually going to be that bad, because the one thing that hasn't changed or doesn't seem to be changing about Donald Trump is the transactional nature of his politics. So if we're able on an individual level to offer him a good deal of any sort, maybe, playing a devil's advocate here a little bit, maybe that's not going to be that bad.
I think that that's too much oriented towards the original logic of how we treated Trump 1. Trump 2 will not only be transactional. You were referring to Viktor Orban, who is a close associate of him, someone who Trump is looking up to. He's listening to him. And he has a very negative, Trump has a very negative sentiments vis-a-vis multilateralism. So he has a negative sentiment towards the multilateral EU. So I do not think that with simple transactional you will be able to deal with him. You need to deal with him in a different way. And that makes it extremely difficult from a European perspective, because if you have the Viktor Orbans and others who are opposing to have a unified position when it comes to Donald Trump, who want to use Donald Trump in order to undermine the European Union from within, they have a different vision of the EU in their mind. You need pro-European forces who will be countering, who will be ready to work together, who will be ready at the European level to work together. And this is where the question of Germany is a big question, because without Germany, you do not have a strong enough leadership in the European Union. France and Germany alone won't be able to deliver. You also need the Polish. You also need other Central and Eastern European partners on board to play a much stronger role than they played in the past. So we need a coalition of those who are willing and able of the European level to react to what actually is a global Zeitenwende. It's not a Zeitenwende which only affects Germany. It's a global Zeitenwende. And Trump, too, is a catalyst for making the situation, we're making the situation not only dealing with the U.S., but also with a lot of the global problems we're facing much more difficult in future. So the pressure on Europe is much higher than it has been in the past.
Hopefully he will actually be a catalyst of change for good. Germany's in crisis, we all seem to be agreeing on that much, but we also know that Europe needs strong and stable Germany just as much like Germany needs strong and stable Europe. Sophie Braunschlegel, Yanis Emanuelidis and Florian Eder were our guests tonight. Thank you very much. The chances of Olaf Scholz remaining in office beyond 2025 are slim, if they exist at all. The question is, who will replace him and under what circumstances. Issues of economic stagnation and migration will likely persist. So a simple change of government might not satisfy the deeply disillusioned electorate and may only add fuel to the fire of radical politics. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we'll touch upon an issue we're hoping never to examine: the growing role of nuclear weapons in international politics. Make sure you're with us next Thursday, and have a good evening.